Jeannie Salisa.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. As New Zealanders, we are becoming fast tenants in our own land. In Auckland, where a third of our population live, 57% rent, Mr. Speaker. They are tenants. And for Māori people, only 28% own their own homes, which means 72% of tangata whenua in Aotearoa rent. They are becoming tenants in their own land. For Pacific people, the number is even worse. 18% of Pacific Islanders own their own homes. So that means 82% of all Pacific people in New Zealand are tenants. Mr. Speaker, 82%, because home ownership is just so unaffordable for the majority of Pacific people in this country. 5 years ago, in 2010, our Prime Minister, John Key, he stated, and I quote, "I'd hate to see New Zealanders as tenants in our own country." He probably wishes that he didn't make that statement, Mr. Speaker, because that is unfortunately the future that so many New Zealanders are faced with now, being tenants in our own land because people just cannot afford to buy their own houses. This is not surprising, of course, particularly in Auckland, where the average price of a house is $855,000 and climbing each week. South Auckland, Mr. Speaker, has suffered one of the worst fallout from this government's lack of control, with house prices having risen by 79% since 2008 and rising by 19% since last year alone. The government promised that there would be no more asset sales, which is yet another broken promise, because that is exactly what this government is currently doing, particularly with selling off of our second largest asset, our state houses. That is exactly what this government is doing, selling it off to their mates, to their private developer friends, and to overseas companies. Instead of keeping their promise of no more asset sales, this government is going ahead with selling off our farmlands, selling off our school lands, selling off our school houses, and selling off other state-owned enterprises and state assets, in addition to selling off of our state houses. Is this a government who listens to the public, though? Well, sometimes they do. Like just recently in the last few days, or in the last week or so, when they listened to the public, when the public actually said that they should become good international citizens and take on more refugees, that we as a country, that New Zealand as a country should be more compassionate and should be more caring to those refugees overseas. But, Mr. Speaker, instead of waiting for polls and instead of waiting for the focus groups to tell the Prime Minister and this Cabinet and this government to do the right thing with the refugees, this is something that the Prime Minister should have taken leadership on without having to wait for those polls and those focus groups to tell him to do so. On the issue of selling off of our state assets, this government has arrogantly ignored 2/3 of New Zealanders who last term had voted against selling off of our state assets. They voted against selling off Mighty River Power, Meridian Energy and Air New Zealand. Instead of developing and implementing a comprehensive economic vision, Mr. Speaker, this government is just putting their heads in the sand and hoping that the economic realities, in terms of what they say, that when they make the economic realities appear as good and as positive according to the national government, that somehow the people of New Zealand are going to agree that everything is fine, that homes, particularly in Auckland, are not going through the roof. Mr. Speaker, this government would throw away one of our most precious of assets, our homes, the homes that could house our most vulnerable, the homes that actually already house our elderly, the homes that actually house a lot of our disabled, our state-owned homes, Mr. Speaker. And Emilita Bourne, Mr. Speaker, is one, and her family is one of those tenants from my electorate in Otara that unfortunately died because her house was mouldy, leaking, damp and freezing, and she lived in a state house. This morning, Mr. Speaker, I heard the Honourable Bill English on national radio saying that it is the responsibility of tenants, that it is up to tenants to let the government agencies know know that they have maintenance issues. Well, in the case of the Bourne family, Mr. Speaker, the Bourne family let government agencies know not once, Mr. Speaker, not twice, but 48 different times. 48 different times that there were maintenance issue in their house before the unfortunate event of this little girl passing away. Mr. Speaker, this current government, instead of pointing the finger at the previous government of 7 to 8 years ago, it would be great if they actually take responsibility for things that happen on their watch. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.